To learn to live the off-grid lifestyle and to be inspired to live your dreams, click subscribe so you don't miss anything. Click the bell notification. It's all free. So as I'm sure you are aware, I've been asking a lot of poll questions on my community tab. You go to my YouTube channel, you go over to the community tab, and you can see all the poll questions I've been asking recently. And there's several things that I'm trying to do with that. Is one, I'm trying to get an understanding of my audience, what they're looking for, why they watch. It has been real useful information. For example, when I talk about electricity and how I make electricity, if I get too complicated with it, I notice that the watch time in my videos don't do well. Well, watch time is very important in videos. The closer you get somebody to watch 100% in regular speed, the better. Even if you go into slow speed, let's say you reduce it by half, instead of 100% watch time, you get 200% watch time. If you rewind, that's more watch time. So you want watch time. Well, every time I talk about how to hook up solar panels and I get into the technical aspect of it, I don't get good watch time. So when I asked a poll question about solar panels, people said they wanted to learn about solar panels, how to hook them up. They wanted education on it. So that confused me. I'm not really sure how to go about that. So I'm going to try to make a discussion about solar panels that's not boring. And other aspects of electricity, windmills, wind turbines, hydroelectric, and to explain to you why I don't use them, although you could use them, nothing saying you can't. Okay, so I have 1,000 watts of solar panels, and I don't want to get too complicated on this. To understand watts, you take volts times amps. So if you plug something into the wall, your wall outlet is 110 volts, and whatever appliance you're running, let's say it's a 1 amp appliance, 110 times 1 is 110 watts. 110 times 2 amps is 220 watts. And that's per hour. So if you only run an appliance for 5 seconds, then you have to divide that, and then you'll find out how many actual watts you use for that appliance. So refrigerators, they don't run full time. Let's say they only run 10 hours a day, 110 times 10 hours at 1 amp, which isn't true, it's less than 1 amp. So you're up to 1,100, I think, watts, if my math is correct. And you can look on your tag to see how many amps. You got these tags on your plug or behind your appliance. It'll tell you how many amps you're running, so all you got to do is 110 times that amp. I have 10 12 volt 5 amps, I think they're 5 amps, just right around 5 amps, solar panels. Now, when you talk about volts and solar panels, it doesn't add up, because you're actually getting like 20 volts out of these, and you got charge controllers, but again, that's just too complicated. Who cares? My system is a 12 volt system. I bought 12 volt batteries, RV marine batteries, and so I have 12 volt solar panels. Real simple. Now, these solar panels will produce 1,000 watts an hour with the sun fully up in the sky. These are really nice. I really like them. They're not the best, but after all the reviews and YouTube videos, there's a guy called Will Pros. He highly recommends these solar panels. They're called Rich Solar. They're $80 a piece on Amazon. I think you have to buy 2, so it's $160 for 2. These things are amazing. I've had solar panels in the past. These are just fantastic. They're not assembled very well, I will admit that. I had to do some maintenance on them. There's screws that hold the wires in the panel back here. Those screws loosened up, so I just finally soldered the wires. But beyond that, I mean, as far as producing electricity, they do a great job in the shade. And look at this, I'm got all kinds of shade right now. You can see the shade, and these are producing about 3 amps right now. So when the sun pops up over the trees, man, these things just take off. So I've not really had any problems. Now, when you run your solar panels into electric, it's kind of a system, but it's not a complicated system if you can just wrap your head around it. And then you buy a charge controller. So you put your solar panels into a charge controller. And you can see I got some wires on it. I was playing with this. This is a very cheap one. You want what's called an MPPT charge controller. Those have a computer in it, and it regulates constantly how much sun you're getting, how many volts you're getting, how many amps you're getting, and it's constantly trying to adjust the charge. And they do really good. Back in the day, 15, 20 years ago, when I started working with solar panels, they only had these cheap ones. They didn't even have displays on them back then. Now this one says MPPT, but it's not. I don't know why they called it, but it's pretty cheap. And so you got to figure out how many amps you're going to get. So I got a 60 amp charge controller because I have 50 amps of solar panels. And this thing's so easy to wire up. You have 2 wires on each solar panel, a positive and a negative. So you take all the positives from your solar panel and you put it into the positive inlet on the bottom of the MPPT. And then you take all the negatives and you put all those negatives into the negative of the input of the charge controller. But then you just run a wire from the battery, positive to the battery, positive, negative to the battery, so positive, negative, and run them to the battery. If you want multiple batteries, you just hook up multiple batteries, positive, 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 negative, 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 negative. And that gives you more amp hours. Still got 12 volts. Not going to get into series and parallel and all that. If you want more amps, 12 volts, more amps, just keep putting more batteries. So if you have a 100 amp battery, and you put another battery in there, positive, positive, negative, negative, now you have a 200 amp battery. Another battery, positive, 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 negative, 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 you have a 300 amp battery. All of them are 12 volts. And then you run your battery, you just hook a wire from the battery to what's called an inverter. Inverter just inverts electricity, DC electricity, which is what this is, 12 volt DC, into AC electricity. Ignore the mess. This is where we've been storing our straw. We lived in this for a long time. It was our mobile home. Okay, so here you can see, I think you can see, it's pretty dark in here. You can see my charge controller, MPPT charge controller. And that's all, there's no brand name to this. It's a solar MPPT charge controller. I run that into the batteries, and then I have 5 batteries. And then the batteries run into an inverter. So, and then the inverter, you can see I just plugged a wire into the inverter that runs up to the house. I have a car battery charger right here. That way, if it's cloudy or something, or I want to get a maintenance charge, I can run the generator. Generator turns this on and charges the batteries. Pretty simple. To me, I get excited every time I start talking about it. I'm not any kind of master electrician. I do it as a hobby, a novice. And I've done it all my life. My dad used to bring these little motors home. He worked at the grocery store. And back in the day, they'd have these little signs that would spin on these little battery operated motors. He'd bring those home and I would hook them up and play with them. So I've always been interested in DC electric. It's not that complicated, and I really do encourage people to go out and buy an 80, I mean, if you got the money, of course. I'm not telling you how to spend your money, but go out and buy an $80 solar panel. Of course, I know you got to buy 2. But you get yourself a cheap charge controller if you don't want to get the expensive one right now. I have 2 cheap ones just as backups. In case my expensive one burns up, I can just plug this in. I'd still be making electricity, not as good, but I'd be still making electricity until I could replace the expensive one. There are other options. People will tell you, well, what about wind power? I had wind power. My recommendation is to buy yourself a wind turbine. Now, I don't do it here because it's not very windy here. We live in all these trees, and the wind really gets knocked back by the trees. Even when we have a big 60-mile-per-hour windstorm here, nothing really gets affected down here. I built one before, and I used an old generator, and I made my own turbine, and I put it up there, and it worked okay. It didn't produce enough volts to turn on the charge controller, this right here. It just never spun fast enough, but it did produce a lot of amps. So let's say I was getting 12 volts. You got to have like 14 volts in order for the charge controller to kick on. Again, don't want to get into complications of that because it's a 12 volt system, but you got to get it higher than 12 volts to actually charge it. But it produced a lot of amps. So when my solar panels would kick on the charge controller, then I would get the amps from the windmill. So instead of getting 5 amps from a solar panel, I would get, let's say, another 20 amps from the windmill. But it had to have the solar panels to work. It had to. Which was disappointing to me because I wanted it to work at night. Now, that's why I say if you're going to do it, you may want to buy one. Now, I've talked about hydroelectric a lot. And the same thing. It would take, I could do it. In theory, I could do it. But it would take a lot of experimentation. And it would cost a lot of money. Again, you would need a generator of some sort of motor. And you'd have to get it to spin at a certain RPM. Well, remember, your creek only spins at a certain amount of speed, so you would have to funnel it, or you'd have to do this or that, and it would just take a lot of work if you don't know the science. But I just watched a video. Guy spent at least a couple $1,000, and he built this big water wheel, and he hooked it up, and water was falling down on it, and it was amazing. But he wasn't getting anything to work, so he hired this guy, a YouTuber actually. He came over with some equipment, and he hooked his equipment up to it, and he was only getting 7 volts. Now, like I told you, in order to kick on your charge controller, you got to have 14 volts. He wasn't spinning fast enough. Now, the solution probably would be is different gear sizing. The problem with all this is it's all experimental, and you're spending money, and the guy that I watched, said he was going to have to move the pipes around and do this and that. There's just a lot of experimentation. Whereas if you go out and buy a hydroelectric device, so I hope I can inspire you to really think about generating your own electric. Thanks for watching.